Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I want to show you guys how we could assign unique IDs to each object inside of our game scene so that the scene can basically remember exactly which object we're talking about if we have more than one of the same type. Basically, the idea of a GUID is it's a unique identifier that will never be the same as any other object inside of the game. So by maintaining a reference to that identifier, we can always find that object within our scene, whether we leave the scene and come back or we load the game. So specifically, if we want to have a scene where we have some game objects that are always going to exist in the scene, we load them out of the box, and we may want to change some data about that as the game progresses, then one way we could give those objects the GUID ID is to have another game object, which would be a GUID manager for the scene. So in order to, let's say, give the save me game object a GUID for its position saver script, I will start by creating a empty game object, and this will be separate from that object altogether. I'm going to call it GUID manager, and inside the GUID manager I'm going to create a new script. We will call it, I guess, scene GUID manager, because it's going to manage the objects for this particular scene. And then if we open this up for editing, we can allow it to do what it's going to do. So for this GUID manager to work, we're going to want it to assign GUIDs to other monobehavior scripts that are going to implement an interface. And that interface is going to be called IQuit, representing that it has a GUID attached to it. So this scene GUID manager is going to manage IQuit objects inside of the scene, and IQuit is going to be an interface we'll create here where it will force a monobehavior or anything else we attach it to have a IQuit property, a GUID property attached to it. So we'll do that by right-clicking here, doing new item, and we'll add in an interface. So the interface, I'm going to call it IQuit here, making it public, removing or changing the namespace, and we'll bring that out. So this is going to require a GUID. So we could call this GUID. I'm making it all caps just to keep it distinctive from the class name. Though I guess you could do it like this too, and that would be fine. Up to you. And I guess that's all we'll need in there for right now. We may add stuff to it later on. So inside of this manager, I'm going to maintain a list of a class we'll create here. So I guess we'll call this GUID connection, and we'll say GUID connections. And this GUID connection class, we can declare it down here. So this will be GUID connection, and this will take a IQuit. And this GUID connection class type I'll create down here. So public class GUID connection. And this will need a public IQuit object, connected object rather, and then it will also need, so inside of the class, public class, so inside of the GUID connection class, I'm going to need a reference to the game objects that implement IQuit. So I guess I'll call this GUID object. That makes more sense to me. And then I think we're going to want a GUID here as well. So this GUID will be the same thing in the object, but I just want to represent that in the list as well. So the IQuit will have its own GUID, but that should be the same one that we set up in here. So as you can see, the object doesn't serialize immediately, so I'm going to make that serializable. And now our list of GUID objects or GUID connections will show up here, so we can add one in. Okay, so as you can see, it doesn't really serialize right here. IQuit, because it's an interface, it doesn't serialize out of the box. If you use a tool like Odin Inspector, you can make interfaces actually serialize, and then you can assign that. GUID also not serializable out of the box. So one way we could get around this would be to have different fields for what actually publicly displays. So we could say public game object, and this will be game object that has IQuit script attached, and then maybe we can do some checking over later, and then that will pull the IQuit in here. And then rather than serializing the GUID itself, what we can do is let's say just do a string. we can just do lowercase grid, and that should be okay. But maybe we get rid of this field because it's not really going to be necessary. Whenever we want to get the grid, we'll just get the grid out of that grid object. And let me make sure, we're going to want get and set. So the interface will have a requirement for a set as well, so that the grid manager can set the grid on the grid object. So this variable right here, we're going to want to make sure that this changes whenever the grid object changes. Let's take a look over here. Okay, so now we have the ability to set a game object here and a grid here. We're actually going to want this to be a read-only field, so let's make that a thing. Or we could make it private and then serialize it. So serialize field, that'll be good. We can remove that up there. So what we're going to want to happen is whenever this game object is changed, if this grid field has not been set, then it's going to generate a GUID, and it's going to assign that to the IQuit interface inside of the game object. So how we can make that assign a new GUID if one does not exist is we can create a onValidate method. So onValidate for the mono behavior, and this will assign the GUID of the connection to the GUID of the object. Generate one if none exists inside of the connection. And we're only going to generate the GUID with this class because we don't want to accidentally generate one randomly on the game object. And we also might accidentally delete that game object or something, so we're going to want those GUIDs to remain statically stored inside of the scene GUID manager, or wherever the safest place we could find to store it would be. So onValidate. So we're going to need a for each GUID connection in GUID connections. So if the game object is set, then we want to check for its IQuit component. So game object, oh, hold on, be careful. It needs to be connection.gameObject. We're not referring to the mono behavior game object, but the game object stored in here as a reference. We're going to need that to get the component, a component that has IQuit attached to it. Okay, I think that works. I'm not 100%. We'll check later. So we'll generate the GUID if none exists. So we can do that with a connection dot. Oh, okay. So we are going to need this to be public down there. I think there's a read-only attribute. So I suppose in this GUID connection we can also set up a actual GUID property. So call that GUID equals, or GUID, and then we'll have get, and then a set. Or actually, maybe we only need a set, because if we were getting, then that would probably be the GUID object or just the string value there. Let's keep that value there private though. So the GUID, whenever we set that, well, shoot, I guess we need a private GUID here too. So the GUID is going to be equal to the value, right? And then whenever we have that GUID set, then we're going to want to change the string value to the string representation of the GUID. So I think that should be okay. Let me take a look now. Okay, and also whenever that's set, we're going to want to set it on the GUID object as well. So GUID object dot GUID equals value. Or actually, we'll just make it equals to the value right there. Okay, so now we want to set that GUID in the outer class. So connection.GUID equals system.GUID.newGUID. Okay, so this should generate a new GUID value, if I recall. And in GUID connection, no, that should be the name of the list up there. We can also get rid of the start and update. I don't think we need it at the moment. Okay, let's see if anything is working so far. Okay, so in order to use this GUID manager, we're going to have some classes that at least implement the IQuit interface, of course. So let's find the position saver and make it implement IQuit. So the interface here, get set. What we could say here is that there is a private GUID. So the save and load method will probably be moved out of here later. And later in this class, we would only create the serializable data type for this monobehavior script and deserialize the data, but not actually write it to the file. That would be the responsibility of the manager. But for right now, we can set some data. So if we do GUID.toString, we can serialize the otherwise unserializable data as a string rather than a GUID. So when we load, and then of course, in order to have that field set, we have to declare it down here. So public string GUID, and we're going to want to load that as well. So we're going to want to set this GUID as the loaded data dot GUID. Can you actually set it straight up like that? Okay, so I'm not certain about if you can do this, but we can give it a shot. We will just cast it as a GUID. Okay, so in order to bring the string GUID back as an actual GUID object, we can do new GUID, and we can put in the string, so loaded data.GUID, and that should work there. Okay, so we have the GUID saved and loaded as a string, and it returns to a GUID object. Let me see, is there anything else we need here? Maybe we should do some validation checking. So if the GUID connection has a game object set, but there's no GUID script, then that should error out. So if GUID script is equal to null, then we debug log a warning that the attached game object in the scene GUID manager does not have a monobehavior script that implements IQuit interface. Okay, good enough. So let's see, down here it's generating the GUID if none exists, but does that actually get assigned? In theory it would be assigning with the set. Assign new GUID object to, or sorry, assign new GUID to the IQuit script. Okay, there's quite a few things going on here, so it's going to need a little bit of testing, but the basic idea is there. So let's try assigning a game object here for the GUID connection. Okay, so the GUID has been created. I don't believe we have any proof that it assigned there. What's this error message about? GUID connection, set GUID. Let me just open that up. Okay, so basically inside this GUID connection, the GUID object never gets assigned. And by GUID object, I mean the interface up there. So actually, maybe what we should do, since this is the class that's not really supposed to do anything on its own, we will get rid of this part, or rather, we'll bring it up here. So if the GUID script is found, then we're going to assign that GUID up here instead. So the GUID script is going to want the GUID value, so connection.GUID. And then I guess we do need the GUID value, so let's get that. So return underscore GUID as a property, sure. And this should only occur if it actually passes in there, because we obviously can't assign a GUID to a null interface. And then this generate should only occur if there is no GUID set. So if connection.GUID equals GUID.empty, or we could say null, or connection.GUID equals GUID.empty, then we'll generate that. But really I only want that to generate as well if the IQuit object is actually properly assigned. But either way, we do want the values between those two objects to always be the same. So I guess we'll just leave it there and it would reassign on every validate. So I'm going to clear the log here and let's try reassigning it, see if anything happens. Nothing really does. But what I'd like there to be is some kind of field that we could show the GUID value up here in the position saver class just to prove that they're being assigned. So I'm going to add it here, edit the script here. And let's actually make a private string here, which will be called GUID. And then we'll serialize that field. The private is so that it can't be changed in the inspector. And then in order to access the value out of here, I think we're actually going to need to make that a non-auto property. Okay, so get is going to return whatever the underscore GUID is set to, and then set is going to set GUID to a value, but when that value is set, if it's ever set, GUID is going to be equal to underscore GUID.toString. Also, I do want to initialize this. Okay, so that might work. Let's take a look at the inspector and see what happens. Okay, that's actually pretty close to what we want. So the GUID is showing up here in the position saver, and we have the GUID manager over here, which has the same GUID. So what happens if I change this for some ridiculous reason, and then we go back over here? Does it update? No, it does not, at least initially. So we would need to fix that. But at least the GUID manager is assigning the GUID to the position saver. Let's see if we can get something that... Let's see if we can set something up so that anyone in the editor wouldn't make bad things happen like that. These should always be the same. Okay, so one idea I have in mind here is to make it read only, and then we would have this GUID be set up in the constructor method for this object. So GUID connection, and then we're going to want to generate a GUID right here rather than ever allowing anyone to change it. So what we could do here would be GUID equals system.GUID.new GUID, and then this will be the only place we ever set it. So yeah, we're going to change some stuff up there. And then when that is set, so we also want GUID.toString here, and then this will be the only place that string gets set. I believe we can actually turn this into an auto property now. So let's try that. And we can make this a private set because we don't want it to be accessed from anywhere else. Okay, this is already looking a lot better. So up here, if none exists, well, that will never happen because in the constructor here, it's generating a GUID. So we don't need this check anymore. But we do always want to make sure that that gets assigned. Okay, let's take a look at the Unity inspector now. Okay, well, it doesn't look like there's an out-of-the-box way for the read-only to prevent you from editing this, but the one option you could do is to create a custom editor script, which would involve a little bit more coding to set that. So how I usually do it is I use an attribute called read-only. It exists in Odin, which is a premium add-on you can pick up in the asset store. It helps in serialization to the Unity inspector, and it also has a more advanced serializer for writing data to a file. And the read-only attribute that exists in there, it would lock down this field for editing inside of the inspector. So you wouldn't have to write it yourself. But just, yeah, know that that would be a weakness. If you can edit that, that's not great. Also, another recommendation I might want to add, when you have your lists here, and obviously it's going to look a little different for you. It looks like this because I have Odin Inspector installed. But when you have these lists, you might want to make it harder to, let's say, delete that in here. That would be a good recommendation as well. Once again, you can write custom inspectors, look into that kind of stuff. Because the idea here is you really don't want to like lose these references unless you're absolutely sure you want to get rid of them. Otherwise, when you hit plus and you generate a new one, it's going to create a new GUID. So those are some things to think about going forward. So you can see how over here in the position saver script, it lost the reference because the GUID connection, the original one, no longer exists. Now, if I assign this game object over here, then it should get this GUID value and reassign that. So that works. The only problem is we need to do everything possible to make sure that the GUID manager does not lose these references. So what I would probably do is, if you have these GUID connections here, anytime that you would allow it to delete an object, like hitting this X button over here, you can have an editor-based script to have a pop-up here to say, are you sure you want to delete this object? So perhaps what we can do in the next video is to set up some protections here so that our GUIDs cannot be changed so easily. So until then, that's going to be it on the basics of adding GUIDs to your game objects using a scene GUID manager. I've been Chris, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in my future Unity content.